The Energy Room dives into the dynamic world of energy infrastructure. Hosted by Maurice Kinyalimwea, a visionary politician engineer shaping the future of our fragile, expensive electric grid. In each episode, Maurice brings together the brightest minds and passionate innovators who are building resilient energy systems that power our lives. Tune in to discover what it takes to engineer tomorrow's energy systems. Whether you're an industry leader, a curious guest, or a subscriber eager to stay ahead in the ever-evolving global energy landscape, welcome to the Energy Room.
Welcome, Liz Muller, to the Energy Room podcast.
Thank you so much, Maurice. I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. It is so nice to have you here. So in part 2, I would like to talk about some other topics that I think are really beneficial for why deep fission is important and why advanced nuclear is really going to be necessary for the nation and the world. So here's a quote from U.S. Department of Energy Secretary Christopher Wright. With the emergence of AI and President Trump's pro-American manufacturing policies at work, American civil nuclear energy is being unleashed at the perfect time. Liz, my question to you is this the perfect time?
Absolutely. So we are seeing right now an acceleration in the nuclear space that certainly I've never seen before. I've been in the nuclear industry for about 10 years, so not as long as many, but this is new. And in the early days, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, it felt like it was an upstream battle and that it was not easy. That has changed, and there's been multiple layers of the change. So I think climate change has been part of this for a long time. I think the war in Ukraine accelerated people's recognition that we need stable, secure, independent technology for electricity generation. And certainly now, the new developments of AI and the need for these big data centers is just further accelerating this requirement. And I think there's more interest right now in nuclear power and getting it online as quickly as we possibly can than at any other point in my lifetime.
It's interesting that you mentioned the data centers, Liz, and thank you for that. The hyperscalers are just, I mean, they are just ready to gobble up any kind of power that they can. You read Utility Dive, you read any of the power and energy magazines out there, whether they're, an audio magazine or a written magazine, and you're reading that this AI data center or hyperscaler wants to site power generation at their facility. And they're in a vertically integrated territory. And you're like, how in the world can they do that? It's a vertically integrated territory. And they're saying, we need to do this. And then the administration, Congress is saying, you need to figure out a way to do this. And regulators are scratching their heads sometimes. How can we legally do this? And so it just lends to an environment of where it's like everyone is scrambling to meet a need when, as you mentioned, 10, 15 years ago, this was just like an uphill battle. Like, what do you mean nuclear? Look at Vogtle. Look at the cost overruns of Vogtle. And now it's like, as you're saying with deep fission, you want to make sure that this is done in a cost-effective manner, which I think is so important to lead with that, Liz. And that is, I think, really going to be deep fission's benefit, that you're leading with the cost effectiveness.
Yeah.
In addition to that, you mentioned, I really expected you to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and how that taught us to rethink our supply chains and even our energy supply chains. But you're really saying it's the war in Ukraine that has taught us to rethink our energy supply chains. So why do you think that's the case? It's the war in Ukraine that is getting us on board as a country. This is one thing that I think is bipartisan, that we're all thinking that Ukraine is teaching us something new about our energy supply chain. Can you explain that a little bit more for everyone, Liz?
Yeah, of course. I think the big issue was really that of Russian natural gas as being the source of heat and electricity in so much of Europe. And I think Europe had, in many ways, taken that for granted and just assumed they didn't need their own source of heat and electricity because they were able to get natural gas from Russia. That changed with the war in Ukraine, and all of a sudden, European countries didn't want that dependency on Russia, and they recognized the importance of energy independence and having a source that was reliable and not dependent on politics. Perhaps most highlighted in Europe, I think it was a lesson that was really learned all over the world as people started questioning their supply chains for something that is as critical to life as electricity.
It's really amazing that you talk about, thank you, Liz, that you talk about the natural gas that is needed in Europe and how the majority of that, if I'm not mistaken, all of it really and truly comes from Russia. What is it? The Nord pipelines, right? There's Nord 1, I think, and Nord 2, if I'm not mistaken. And I think there was a plan for a Nord 3, and that's been challenged because of the war in Ukraine, the war between Russia and Ukraine. And so, yeah, it's really interesting that it wasn't solely um, nuclear power, but the energy that became a political bottleneck or choke point between the EU slash the United States and Russia with the war in Ukraine and them having to rethink that. And of course, many in the EU being our allies, them having to rethink their how they procure energy to heat their homes and support the industrial manufacturing base, that it made us rethink how we do the same, but with a resurgence in nuclear energy, if I'm not mistaken, Liz.
Yeah, I think that's right. So nuclear wasn't necessarily part of the problem, and but it was the answer. And so the problem was importing natural gas from Russia, but the obvious answer that everyone has been gravitating towards is that if we don't have our own natural gas, well, what is something that we can control? What is something that is secure and reliable and always available 24/7? And the answer to that was nuclear power, and other things too. But I think nuclear is really the steady source of electricity that we can count on.
That is beautifully put, Liz. I can't get any better than that. Thank you for that, Liz. So who are some of the players to make small modular reactors work? And actually, before we get to that question, let me ask you another question because I think we need to get to this for our guests. What is the difference between fission and fusion?
Yeah, I love this question. Yeah, the simplest way of thinking about it is fission is when you take an atom and it falls apart. People talk about it breaking apart, but I like the image of it falling apart. So it's like it just gets too big and it can no longer sustain its own size, and so it breaks apart into smaller pieces. Fusion, and on the other hand, is when you have multiple smaller um, pieces that come together and they fuse together. And both of these can create energy.
Oh, interesting. So is there is fusion better than fission? Why have we focused on fission for the past, very long time? So and where does deep fission's role play within the evolution of fission?
Yeah, great question. So we have fission is working today. So we have commercially operating nuclear fission reactors, hundreds of them all over the world. So it's been proven out. There's an existing supply chain. We have fuel. We have regulations that apply to nuclear reactors with fission. So moving forward with that, I think, is a faster path than moving forward with fusion. Now, fusion has fantastic potential. It is potentially even more energy dense than fission is, but it is not yet commercially operational today. So there is more risk involved. The joke with fusion is that it's 10 years into the future, and it always is going to be 10 years into the future because we've been saying that for decades
Yeah.
already. I think there is a lot more going on in fusion than we have seen historically. So I think maybe it really is only ten years into the future right now.
Yeah.
But if we want a fast path that is going to allow us to build these data centers, which we're building now, right? This is not something we're going to be able to wait on. We need to get it operational right as away as fast as we possibly can. And fission is really a much more practical, much more achievable solution for the near term.
Great. That's a great answer. So let me ask you this question. This is kind of like that 10-year out question, okay? So would you think of, or do you think of deep fission as an application set or application type for nuclear power? Meaning that today fission is, of course, readily available. Different types of reactors are built utilizing the process of fission, but fusion, not so the case today. So could there be a deep fission reactor in the next 5, 7 years? Could there be a deep fusion reactor in the next, let's just say, 15 to 20 years? Is it really your application that you are doing something so advanced, so revolutionary that how that type of nuclear technology is utilized, you can make it better and cost effective by your deep process?
Yeah, another great question. I think that what's so exciting about deep fission is that we are able to take technology that has already been proven out and exists around the world. So we're able to use pressurized water reactor technology, which is the most common type of nuclear reactor that exists today. We're able to use standard 5% enriched uranium fuel, which is, again, the type of fuel that just about every reactor in the United States and around the world uses today. So we have a supply chain that already exists, which is an advantage because many other advanced reactor companies, certainly for fusion, there isn't a supply chain that exists today. And so creating that supply chain is a lot of work. There's some risk involved, as well as significant cost. Now, what deep fission is doing different and what makes this so exciting is the fact that we are taking this existing standard technology and putting it in a completely new environment. So, the real insight that we had is that if you take pressurized water reactor technology and standard fuel, but you put it a mile underground, then you can take the cost out. And I'm happy to go into that in more detail if that's of interest.
Oh, certainly, Liz. Let's keep this going. So how do you take that cost out by bringing in the different parts of the puzzle that are already well known, established, and set?
So if you look at a typical nuclear power plant today, and maybe we can ask our listeners to imagine one in their mind, what you probably imagine is a large structure. So a lot of concrete, a lot of steel, very large buildings. And in fact, what you're seeing is the construction. So the nuclear reaction itself, nuclear fuel is very, very dense. So if you use nothing but nuclear power to power your entire life, the fuel that you would use would fit inside a soda can, right? So nuclear fuel is extremely dense. And so all
So
of
hold on, hold on, Liz. So you're telling me all the nuclear fuel that's needed to power your life and my life are 2 cans of soda?
that's
Can fit within 2 cans of soda?
that's right. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, that is one of the huge advantages of nuclear power. So if you were to think about, if you were 100% powered by coal, how much coal would you require? I don't know the answer to that, but it's a lot, right?
It's a lot of coal. It's a lot of coal.
Probably not going to be something that would fit into a soda can. So that's what's so amazing about nuclear power and nuclear fission is the density of the energy that you get. But when you look at a nuclear power plant, that's not what you see. What you see are very, very large structures. And an estimate by the US Department of Energy is that 80% of the cost of nuclear power is in these large structures. It's the physical construction, it's the concrete, it's the steel, it's the inspections that are required to make sure that that doesn't degrade over time. And that's fundamentally the reason that nuclear power is so expensive. It's not the fuel, which is remarkably dense. It's the supporting structures all around it. Now, when you go into a borehole, you don't need those structures because you have them already. So what do I mean
Mm.
specifically? Well, you have so a lot of the structure that you see is for containment. So if something goes wrong with the nuclear reaction, you need to make sure that it doesn't get out and impact the surrounding environment. And so a lot of the concrete and a lot of the steel is for that purpose, for containment. Well, if you're in a borehole a mile underground, surrounded by billions of tons of rock, you already have that containment. You don't need to build it because it's just already there, a feature of being in a borehole.
Yeah,
Another
it's natural containment.
natural containment, that's right.
Mm.
And then the next part of this is pressure. So, when you are looking at a pressurized water reactor, you need 160 atmospheres of pressure so that the water, when you're making the water boil, you don't want it to boil at a very low temperature because then you wouldn't be able to get high quality electricity out of that. So what you do is you create 160 atmospheres of pressure. You have a pressurizer, you have a pressure vessel. Your reactor itself requires a very thick wall to withstand this pressure. But when you're in a borehole a mile underground and that borehole is full of water, like ours will be, then as any scuba diver would know, you have about 1 atmosphere of pressure for every 10 meters of depth that you go down. So if you
Yeah.
go down 1.6 kilometers, that's 160 atmospheres of pressure. That's exactly what you want. And so you don't have to build a pressurizer. You don't have to have a reactor vessel that is thick to withstand the pressure because the pressure is just a feature of being in this borehole. And then I'll add one more thing to that, which is the emergency cooling system. So, one of the reasons that nuclear plants are expensive, among all of the others that I've mentioned,
Yeah.
the emergency cooling system. So, you need to have water in case anything goes wrong, that it will cool the reactor down and prevent something from happening. Well, you don't. you have the water above you already in the borehole. So you can have your reactor in a borehole a mile underground. You don't need any additional emergency cooling system because you are surrounded by one. In fact, it's a mile in length, and there's plenty of water in there if anything ever were potentially to go wrong. So the truly remarkable thing that we discovered, I mean, it felt like a discovery more than an invention here, is that we discovered that when you're in a borehole a mile underground, all of the things that cost so much money to build for a typical pressurized water reactor, you don't need. You have them already just as a feature of being in a borehole a mile underground.
That's that's amazing, Liz. It's amazing that going someplace where power isn't generated today, outside of, maybe geothermal, for example,
Yeah.
is actually our extremely beneficial environment and safe environment for nuclear power generation. That's not something that I think any one of us outside of yourself and Deep Fission and your colleagues would think, but it's factual. Just how you explained that when you go down 1.6 kilometers, at about 1.6 kilometers, that's 165, you said,
160
atmosphere.
years. Yeah.
160 atmosphere. So basically, that's why you go 1 mile deep or 1.6 kilometers deep, because of the attributes of when you reach that depth in the Earth's crust. That's just amazing, Liz. I don't know how it gets better than that.
Well, I'm glad
Um,
you mentioned geothermal because that's also one of the technologies that we can leverage for this approach. So we're able to drill the hole using technology out of the oil and gas industry. So the oil and gas industry has gotten really, really good at drilling holes a mile underground. So we use that to drill our hole. Then we use existing pressurized water reactor technology for our reactor at the bottom of the borehole. But then we're able also to leverage geothermal technology in terms of how do we get the heat out of the borehole in order to generate electricity at the surface. So it's really a remarkable combination of different technologies, all of which are coming together for deep fission.
it is. It seems that you're really doing a good job of stacking the benefits for deep fission and what that means in terms of powering lives and powering the quality of lives for the customers that would benefit from this technology. Let's talk about your commercialization plan. Where are you in the stage of commercialization? Talk to us about that.
So, as a company, we are about 2 years old now. So, we're still pretty new on the scene for nuclear power. We are working on our design. So, we are pretty close to having a preliminary design. We published a paper on our conceptual design, which is now available. We've submitted it and discussed it with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So, it is publicly available. Now we're moving to a preliminary design, and we expect to have that done before the end of the year. Now, once we have our preliminary design completed, we are also working with a first customer to confirm a first location. We have Endeavor Data Centers that's already signed up to be our first customer, and we are currently identifying locations that would be the right locations for the first build out. Um, with the executive orders and sort of the direction of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to move even faster than it has been, we think we can be commercially generating electricity in 2028. So we had been saying 2029 prior to these executive orders, but I think now we expect 6, maybe even 12 months can be shaved off of our commercialization plan, which is pretty exciting. I'll also add that we are really intrigued by the executive order on use of data centers and nuclear power on Department of Defense sites. So if we have the ability to move forward with that and to work with the Department of Defense and to build these nuclear reactors for AI data centers on DoD land, then I think we could potentially even be commercially operational by the end of 2026 or 2027.
To hear anything, Liz, to hear a timeline for any type of power plant, in this case, a nuclear power plant, being operational sooner rather than later is an achievement and a feat to be applauded by anyone. I mean, that is just amazing that you think in 2028 for commercial operation or possibly 2026 for DoD operation. That means, I mean, you could tell me if I'm wrong, but that means that the federal government might be moving faster than private industry, that they want this so much for national security reasons that this is important for them to prioritize. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah, and to be clear, it's not that the commercial industry wouldn't want to move faster. I think they want to move as fast as they possibly can.
Okay.
The challenge is the regulatory review time by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So, we want to make sure that we have a license process that proves that our reactor is as safe as we expect it could be. So we don't want to cut any corners with that process, but I also don't believe it needs to be slow. Right. So I think this
Yeah.
is getting the balance right of making sure that we do all that we prove everything is as we expect it to be, and demonstrate that to the regulator and get it done in the sorts of timeframes that I think are necessary to address our electricity needs. Now, on the commercial side, right now, we still expect that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is going to be the relevant regulator. They have been making strides to move faster, and I expect that they will, with the executive orders, be able to go even faster, but we're still expecting sort of a minimum of 12 to 18 months to get through that process. So that is really the limiting factor in our 2028 commercialization timeframe for private use. Now, with the DoD, they have a little bit more regulatory leeway, flexibility. I'm not sure what the right term is. We still want to meet the same very strict safety standards and environmental standards that we would if we were going through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But there is potentially the ability to demonstrate that we do meet those standards faster than if we're going through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So that's really the difference between the commercialization timeframe for Department of Defense and purely commercial reactors.
Okay, great. And for the DoD, is that through an office that is part of the US Department of Energy? There's an office that's within, they deal with making sure that our nuclear arsenal is safe, that so whether it's inspections or other things, is it through that office or is it another entity that's solely defense that deals with that?
Yeah, this is really the Department of Defense. The Department of Energy does do a lot of work on test reactors and has the responsibility ultimately for nuclear reactors outside of the Department of Defense. They also have a program that is looking to move forward an accelerated time frame for test reactors. That could also be of interest to Deep Fission, but we don't really think we necessarily need a test reactor.
Okay.
The work that we're doing, because it is pressurized water reactor technology that has already been used for hundreds of sites around the world, we think we can go directly to commercially operating reactors.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that distinction. I really appreciate it. I'm here looking at one of the executive orders promoting nuclear power that was signed on May 23rd, 2025. So I'm glad we're talking today. If we were talking before,
Yeah,
then these executive orders wouldn't have been signed and we wouldn't have this to discuss.
right.
But one of them talks a lot of, or focuses, I should say, on streamlining construction and approvals And as you mentioned, reducing the regulatory approval timelines for new reactors to as little as 18 months, in some cases, maybe 12 months. So it's good to see that the office of the president, Secretary Wright, the federal government are taking it seriously to find ways to reform civilian nuclear and make sure that America can play a lead in civilian nuclear energy production for the country. So let me talk a little bit also about your fundraising. So how is fundraising? I know this fundraising environment right now is very challenging. Fortunately for you, nuclear is a very hot topic. So, you have your commercialization plan. There are ways to make sure that your commercialization plan can be successful with some of the work that you talked about with the NRC and Endeavor data centers. But tell me a little bit about your fundraising and how you think that you can get to scale with developing your preliminary design, which you're going to need to submit sometime in the near future.
Yeah, fundraising is always sort of a challenge. It can be a fun challenge, but it is an ongoing process. So yes, we have been fundraising and we are continuing to fundraise. I think a couple of the things that are pretty interesting about what we're doing is the low amount of capital or the relatively low amount of capital that is required. So we do have to drill a hole, right? So that is not free, but nor is it super expensive. Like there's more to drillers who can do it. It is competitive and commercially available today. We also need some basic manufacturing, but we probably aren't going to need the sort of massive manufacturing facility that many advanced nuclear reactors need, simply because we don't have as many parts as they do. So I mentioned earlier, we don't need the containment dome, we don't need the pressurizer. The materials that we're using are straightforward ones that have already been tried and for which there is an existing supply chain. So we think that our costs for building a reactor are going to be remarkably low, and that is very helpful. First of all, we're not going to need to fundraise as much as many other companies are. And then second of all, the return on investment is going to be much faster because we can be profitable for the first one that is implemented.
Wow. So what's your timeline, you think, to revenue or ARR?
Yeah, so it's the same as what you were asking in terms of how quickly can we get our first reactors up and running. So if that's 2028, then we will get first revenue in 2028. If through working with the Department of Defense, we're able to get online in 2026 or 2027, my expectation is that that would be when we are able to start generating revenue and even be profitable.
Wow, that's excellent, Liz. That is moving as any startup should.
Yeah.
Fast, safe, and making sure you get to revenue and sales. So that is excellent to hear. And I'm glad we were able to talk about your commercialization plan, fundraising, and your timelines, really and truly. I know we're almost at time here. I do want to talk about I do have one more question until we get to something fun, okay?
Yeah.
So what role should RTOs and state regulators play in ensuring the reforms, oversight, and governance needed to make Deep Fission's mission a reality?
Yeah, another great question. Connecting to the grid is slow. It should not be as slow as it is today, particularly given the demand that our society has for more electricity. So that is unfortunate. I think what we may see in the short term and the near term is behind the grid implementations. So, where we don't necessarily need to connect to the grid, at least at first. Maybe we're powering a data center. Maybe we're even powering a small community that doesn't have access to the grid. And then connections to the grid, I think we'll still want those to happen, but those may be slower and happen after we already start generating the electricity.
Liz, that's really funny. It makes me laugh because I've never heard this before, and I think we're going to coin this today together. A nuclear microgrid.
Oh my goodness. Yes.
I mean, if powering a small community, if you're powering a data center and a community, and you're isolated per se, you are in essence a microgrid.
Yeah.
Hence,
Right.
in actuality, this would be a nuclear powered microgrid. And if you can build, I mean, it's quicker to build a distribution circuit than certainly a transmission circuit. So it's amazing to think that in reality, we think about solar microgrids or a natural gas backup solar wind battery microgrid, when in truly we can have through SMR technology and form factor and deep fission's application of existing pressurized water reactors, we can have a nuclear microgrid in operation in the United States before 2030.
Absolutely. I'm as excited as you are, Maurice.
One last question. Are you still backpacking? I know you like to backpack. Are you still backpacking?
I am. Not as often as I did when I was growing up, but last summer, my son, who is now 11, but he was 10 at the time, he and I did a backpacking trip through Yosemite and ended up climbing Half Dome. So it was a fantastic experience. So, yes, still backpacking and still loving it.
Wow. I could just imagine your son. My mom and I have climbed Half Dome, and my mother is going to put nuclear reactors on the opposite side, opposite direction of Half Dome, right? I mean, imagine when his teacher, for example, right, Liz, his teacher asks that question. Hey, what did you do? And why is it interesting to you? And you could say, well, we climbed Half Dome, and my mother's going to put nuclear reactors 1.6 kilometers in the ground in the opposite direction.
Oh my goodness. Yes.
Oh wow, that's really cool. I'm glad you're still backpacking. I'm glad you're able to enjoy that with your family, Liz. And I know as a founder of a startup, it is challenging to have that family life. It is really, really challenging. But I am so glad to hear that you're ensuring that that takes place.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Liz. Liz, it has been a pleasure to talk with you and learn more about who you are. Additionally, you're building something exceptionally great at Deep Fission. You're allowing us ratepayers and customers to rethink American nuclear power generation for the next 100 years, especially America's role in leading the safest and most reliable power source the world has ever seen. Again, thank you, Liz, and I really appreciate your time here today.
Thank you so much, Maurice. Really appreciate it.
Welcome to the Energy Room,